my name is Tony. The Curse of Frankenstein was the film that kick-started the Hammer horror fantasy machine in 1957. Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell was the last entry in their 7-picture Frankenstein series in 1974. In 6 of those films, Baron Frankenstein was played by Peter Cushing. In The Horror of Frankenstein 1970, the Baron's younger incarnation was played by Ralph Bates. The overriding horror of that film was just how bad of an awesomely misfiring and hideously confabulated turkey burger it was. The immaculately poised, elegantly precise and utterly peerless Peter Cushing was there at the beginning. It was only fitting he should be there at the end. That alone was enough to leverage the coin from my pocket and incentivize me to pay to watch it. So I did. I've reviewed The Curse of Frankenstein, the first one, thus thought I'd cut out all the middlemen and time hop straight to the last one. Now that may seem like an odd approach, but it's the one I decided to take, as I'm uncertain if I will ever find the time to do them all. It's not because they weren't any good, you understand, Horror of Frankenstein accepted, although admittedly some were better than others. They all had something to offer and contained scenes and moments that stayed with me down the years. It made sense to me, as much as anything ever does, to set up the bookends first, address how it started and how it ended, and fill in the shelf later. Right, I may never populate that shelf now, but what the hell, nothing's perfect, and like everyone else I've got other shit going on. Some things to know first, it's a cheaply made affair, completely studio bound. Hammer still managed to slap on a veneer of shabby opulence through a vibrant use of colour processing and decent set design, but it's all a bit confined, internalized and stagey. It turned out to be the last film of veteran Hammer director Terence Fisher. Filmed at Elstree in 1972, it didn't get a release until 2 years later. Both critical and box office reception were underwhelming is being kind. It's Hammer's last released gothic horror period piece, and turned out to be not just a swan song for the franchise that started it all, but for Terence Fisher and Hammer's old school style of filmmaking. If nothing else, it emphasized that times and public tastes had changed, and Hammer had failed to keep pace with them. I still wanted to see this stuff, but by this time I was in a very small and rapidly dwindling minority, and who the hell was I anyway? So where are we? Somewhere in Europe, I'd guess. Former second Doctor Who, Patrick Troughton, is in a cemetery digging up a grave. He's a body snatcher, flogging corpses for beer money. I was a grave digger once, mercifully briefly, and let me tell you, it ain't as easy as he makes it look. Nearly fucking killed me. Mind you, nowadays, most physical activity has that effect. He's disturbed by a local cop, but manages to leg it with the body, which he lugs to the domicile of young Dr. Simon Helder, Shane Bryant. Helder is a surgeon, a devotee of Baron Victor Frankenstein, and is conducting experiments on the organs and body parts of the dead. This wholesome, fun-packed activity is curtailed when the only cop in the village apprehends the grave robber pissing it up in the local bar. He instantly grasses Helder, who finds himself before the courts. The judge, Clifford Mollison, decides Helder is something of a nutbar, and sentences him to a brief period of assessment in a mental asylum. Only for 5 years, so with good behaviour he'll be out in never.
Lovely!
Arriving at his new place of residence, Helder encounters 2 aggressive attendants who are very Nazi-like in attitude, only way scruffier and dumber than the Gestapo, and their boss, asylum director Adolf Klaus, John Stratton. Klaus is a sexual deviant, pervert and dithering buffoon who prefers to keep a sizable distance between himself and the inmates, few of whom are attractive enough to consider sexually molesting, one assumes. The 2 goons decide to give Helder some hydrotherapy with a fire hose for the entertainment of the inmates, who spectate and gibber joyously. This jolly jape is interrupted by the arrival of asylum medic Dr. Victor Peter Cushing, wearing a double-take inducing curly blonde wig which Cushing later said made him look like Helen Hayes. Helder recognises the man. It is none other than Soapy Stevens, Wilfred Hyde White, the demon vicar of Little Twatting. No, actually it's not. It is none other than Baron Frankenstein himself. Frank was committed to the asylum some years earlier, but because he'd got some serious dirt on her, Klaus blackmailed the director into falsifying his death and giving him the run of the place so he could continue his experiments in anonymity. Problem is, Frank's hands were burned in a fire, probably the one at the end of Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, and he's been forced to instruct beautiful mute inmate Sarah Madeleine Smith, also known as the Angel, in the art of performing transplant surgery. She's fucking useless at it, but a pretty and kindly soul nonetheless, even if she can't cross-stitch for shit. Upon discovering Helder is a surgeon, he demands Klaus make him his official assistant. Frank has got this hideous Neanderthal throwback Herr Schneider, Dave Prowse, sedated in a cage. He's a homicidal hairy hulk with a fascination for broken glass. He likes to stab people in the face with it. Ideal dinner party guest when the Waterford Crystal champagne flutes are brought out, I should have thought. He tried to commit suicide, but Frank brought him back and had Sarah graft the hands of a deceased sculptor on him. You could graft the hands of Diddy on him and they'd be just as useless. But Frank has a plan. Loopy but gentle ex-world-famous banjo player, Professor Durandal, Charles Lloyd Pack, has just the sort of brain that would sit nicely in the lumpen, misshapen skull of a shambling monstrosity. Frank leaves Durandal's case file hanging around, so the old boy gets to see it. His diagnosis deems him incurable. A tad depressed at this shocking revelation. Seriously, what were you expecting, dude? Durandal hangs himself with his banjo strings. Who says the most practical thing to do with a banjo is throw it in a skip? Guided by Frank, Heldon transplants Durandal's brain into Herr Schneider and gives him a new pair of eyes. So let me get this straight. The monster from hell has 20/20 vision, hands of Rodin, and the brain of a classical banjo player. How do you reckon things will pan out? These days, I'd wager pre-booked ticket sales for his comeback concert would break the internet quicker than an Oasis reunion. Just the sort of show people are crying out for. Somehow, Herr Schneider's body implausibly takes control of Durandal's brain, and the creature goes on a homicidal rampage. He rips up the asylum graveyard in a storm, goes after and kills director Klaus in revenge for the man's attempted rape of his own daughter, that's Sarah by the way, and traumatizing her into muteness. Told you that Klaus was a sick pervo. The two attendants open fire on the monster with their pistols. Wounded, he seemingly turns his attentions to Sarah. The inmates, mistakenly believing he means her harm, intervene and attack, tearing him to pieces in a welter of limbs, guts and gore. It's just awful. Left with a pile of useless body parts and a trashed lab, Frank straightens his wig and begins cleaning up. Our work must continue, he tells Helder and Sarah, and so I imagine it does, somehow or other, just not in a Hammer film. Of the 6 Hammer Frankenstein films to feature Peter Cushing, it's not the best. There's no way to change that, but out of the 7 picture total, it's not the worst either. At least the preceding Horror of Frankenstein saves it from that fate. The first half of it does manage to generate some haunting power and atmosphere, most notably Cushing's grand entrance, materializing like some commanding black-clad dandy who radiates a cold and forceful control, in that his mere appearance causes the attendants and inmates to stop dead in their tracks. Despite the wig, Cushing's dedication to the role and fastidious attention to detail helps rise above the absurdity. It's not his most indiscriminately evil and wantonly criminal portrayal of the character. That was reserved for Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. In that one, he not only raped but also murdered Veronica Carlson's character, something Cushing was very uncomfortable with and initially resisted. The rape bit, I mean. In this final entry, however, he gives his most mercenary and manipulative take. As Frank's got older, the more icily controlled but insane he seems to have become. Perhaps something to do with the environment. Herr Schneider is by far his least attractive superhuman creation since Kiwi Kingston. And let's face it, he's come up with some outright mingers. Halfway through, John Elder's script lurches into grisly comic book melodramatics and throws in a quite extraordinary scene which to this day leaves me questioning if it was intended to be funny or not. Once Herr Schneider's malformed brain is removed, Frank drops it from height into a bowl on the floor where it splats bloodily. He then accidentally steps in the bowl, tipping the brain out and kicking it skidding across the lab. Intentional or not, on initial viewing I did gasp internally and laugh. Was it meant to be a black comedy slapstick moment? I lean towards yes, but might just be me. A lot of things are, you know. Cinematographer Brian Probin partially succeeds in affording the cramped and constricting sets some sense of space with a creative use of light and shade, but the staginess of it remains inescapably claustrophobic. The impression that the cameras and crew were beavering away just out of shot is never completely dispelled. Is it okay to say beavering these days? Anyway, James Bernard serves up a Hammer by Numbers score that sounds very, very familiar. Not necessarily a problem for me personally, but I can't speak for others. Overall, it's strikes as distinctly creaky and starved of funding. Even Terence Fisher's direction lacks his usual spark, although he does make good inventive use of glass and perspective, especially a jagged half a demijohn the monster wields as a weapon. Shane Bryant is as wooden and lackluster as ever, and Madeleine Smith, who does eventually get her voice back, doesn't have a great deal to say or do other than look angelic, sympathetically caring, and keep her clothes on. Yep, Hammer's compulsory gratuitous nudity manifesto of the time seemed to have passed its expiry date with this one. Plenty of gruesome goriness to make up for it though. Does it make up for it? To some extent, I suppose. Ultimately, I find it stupidly likeable. If there's such a thing as dark gothic pantomime camp, then that's what it's got by the bucket load. I never tire of Peter Cushing doing his thing, and although he was 59 and in poor physical health at the time, he performed all his own stunts in his fights with Dave Prowse. Yeah, that's really him jumping on the monster's back and grappling away. Somehow that sentence doesn't sound quite right. But you know what I'm saying. Fans of a certain sci-fi movie franchise might like to clock that Cushing and Prowse would be later reunited on screen in a much lesser but way more popular and profitable film. Cushing doesn't jump on Dave's back in that one, but I must confess it's something I'd like to have seen. Ooh, that's done it now. I can hear all those toy lightsabers buzzing menacingly into life from here. Cushing remains as compelling as ever, and Prowse's monster is possibly the most primally threatening of them all. Philosophically, these madmen with god complexes fooling around with nature and warping factual human biology to conjure up abominable travesties from dead flesh are probably in the most suitable positions and environment befitting their peculiar obsessions. An asylum. Pity the poor sods in there with them, that's all I can say. I could draw parallels with governments, dictators, activists and people the world over, some certainly closer to home. But what would be the point when, to paraphrase the Fun Boy 3, they really have taken over now? Grateful thanks for your time and attention. Feel free to do whatever you choose to do next. Hit like, don't like, comment, subscribe, check out my early access Patreon thing, or even make a welcome financial contribution via the thanks button. The hour grows late, and there's a glass of famous grouse, how appropriate, in here somewhere with my name on it. I'll resist the urge to dust off my banjo, not a euphemism, lest I disturb the neighbours. And as for you, dear listeners and viewers, sleep tight. I will return, only not with a wig like Frankenstein.